In this segment, I want to just make 2 points about thinking through the logic of international trade and how the conventional arguments are often flawed. So first point is just the very idea of summing up purchases and sales and then referring to it as an aggregate trade deficit or surplus. That actually is loading the deck from the get-go. And I just want you to, first of all, understand what these terms mean. To say, for example, that the United States has a trade deficit with Japan or with China, what that means is that if you look up and add up all of the goods and services that people from the United States buy from people in China, let's say, you come up with a dollar figure. And then you add up all the goods and services that people in China buy from sellers in the United States, and you come up with a dollar figure. And then you just compare the two. And that's where the trade deficit or surplus comes from. Now notice too, just to give you a little of the insight here on some of the real world complexities, it doesn't necessarily just mean goods that are physically produced in one country or the other and then shipped across the ocean. If people from China are tourists and they come to Disney World, the United States, excuse me, and they spend money, well then that counts as them importing services from the United States. Okay, that's just to give you an example of how these trade accounts work. Okay, another real world complication is there's a distinction between a trade deficit and what's called a current account deficit. Okay, and I think there's a footnote in the textbook about that, or you can Google and find out the definitions of that. So if you're really an advanced student and want to get the more accurate terminology, just bear that in mind, that strictly speaking, the thing that worries people and that's unsustainable is if there's a current account deficit, not a trade deficit. But for our purposes, this introductory level, just think about it in terms of trade and goods and services moving across. That's fine. Okay, so now that you understand what does it actually mean in terms of the accounting to say that the U.S. is having a trade deficit with China, for example, what I want to say is, strictly speaking, who cares? That's just some aggregate figure. It's a bit of trivia. And to drive that home, look, we could do the same technique at the state level. We could look at the people in Oregon and the people in Florida. And we could add up all the goods and services that people in Oregon bought from producers in Florida and vice versa. And then we could say, does Oregon have a trade deficit or surplus with Florida? And the answer probably in any given year is not going to be exactly zero. There's probably going to be a deficit one way or the other. But does anybody care? And in particular, let's say it was Oregon was running a trade deficit with the people in Florida. Maybe a lot of people in Oregon were going to the Disney park down there or other vacation areas. And that just in the aggregate, it just so happens that year after year, the people in Oregon buy more goods and services produced by Floridians than vice versa. Is anyone going to be up at night worrying, saying, oh my gosh, this is unsustainable? Pretty soon, there's going to be no dollar bills in Oregon, and Florida's just going to be awash in 20s and 100s, and all the jobs are going to be in Florida, and Oregon people are just going to be totally out of work because we just keep sending all of our wealth down the floor. No, nobody thinks like that, because for a couple of reasons. One is they realize it's completely arbitrary to just draw a line around the state of Oregon and think in terms of that, right? They'd be thinking of it in terms of individual households. And so an individual household might say, oh boy, how are we doing? Are our finances okay? But if the individual household takes a trip down to the Disney park in Florida, and thus that household runs a trade deficit with the state of Florida, even that's not going to matter, because nobody thinks like that. They instead look at their overall position. And so if it's somebody who lives in Oregon, that individual household, if you want to think of it this way, has a trade balance or surplus with the state of Oregon, because that's where their job is. So they sell goods and services to their employer in Oregon, and then they spend their money on all kinds of stuff, from goods and services produced in all different states and then even foreign countries. And so if you ran the numbers that way and did it and computed the accounts, you would find that the Smith household, people who happen to reside in the state of Oregon, in a typical year would run a really big trade surplus with the state of Oregon and would run trade deficits probably with all the other states and then with other countries. Okay, so that's one way to start to get you to see, oh, wait a minute, something's screwy here. That focusing narrowly on bilateral trade flows is useless. It doesn't mean anything. Okay, it's pointless. Now, you could take it to the next level and say, okay, yeah, right, I agree, an individual household is not going to care about running a trade balance or deficit with the state of Florida. That's silly. Nobody thinks like that, and they don't need to. But an individual household would worry about a trade deficit with the rest of the world, because what that means is that individual household is consuming more than its income. Okay, well, let's think through that. I can picture a household that, running the numbers the way we do, has a trade deficit with the rest of the world. Imagine somebody who's 68, he's retired, and he's drawn down his earnings, or his savings, excuse me. Right, he's not producing anymore, and perhaps he's even on net selling off his holdings from his mutual fund. That's fine, right? That doesn't mean that person's doing something immoral or crazy or reckless. So the individual household, what happens typically is in the early years, the household saves, that it spends less buying goods and services from the rest of the world compared to what it's selling, namely its income. And so it builds up its wealth, and then later on it draws it down. Okay, so there's nothing crazy about that. There's no reason that at any given moment in time a household needs to have an exact perfect trade balance with the rest of the world. That would be bad. If the government tried to impose that on households, that would screw everything up. That would totally mess up what people are doing. You wouldn't be able to run a balance during the years of plenty when you were saving, and then you wouldn't be able to run a surplus or a deficit later on. Okay, so, and again, we could keep going down this rabbit hole if we wanted to, and then say, oh, okay, well, is the United States, for example, right now really analogous to a 68-year-old who's living, drawing down? Yeah, at some point the analogy breaks down, but I'm just trying to get you to see that this intuitive knee-jerk, oh my gosh, trade deficit, we got to do something. Just think through the logic of that. If you applied it at the household level, a lot of these things would become a lot clearer. And you would see that the standard way of thinking about it in the context of international trade is actually screwy. It would lead to absurdity. Okay, the other point I want to make in this segment is that a lot of times what will happen is you'll get somebody who's generally in favor of reducing trade barriers, but the person will say, I totally agree that the United States should sign free trade agreements with these other countries, but it's got to be bilateral, right? That if we're going to lower our tariffs against the Chinese or the Japanese or the Europeans or whoever, well, then they got to reciprocate, right? Because we don't want to give a boon to all their producers if we don't get some quid pro quo. So you'll see arguments like that. So the idea is people might generally understand that a world of unfettered free trade makes everybody better off, and so they'd be willing to take steps in that direction if all of us could sort of, lower our weapons simultaneously, but they still have not really grasped the case for free trade if they say that. Because the case for free trade, when you understand the logic of it, it's unilateral. Regardless of what the rest of the world does, your country makes your people richer, your government, if it reduces domestic trade barriers. Okay, so just go back to the hypothetical example of the crazy father, right, who tells his family members, you're not allowed to trade with anyone outside the confines of this household. Well, suppose for some reason there were other neighbors who also had that nutty idea. It wouldn't make sense for the father to say, okay, you're right, you guys have convinced me, my idea is silly, but only when all the other households follow suit will I then allow you guys to trade. No, it's you allow your kids to trade with anybody, and that just opens up opportunities to them. Okay, so that's maybe one way of thinking about it. When the government imposes trade barriers on your domestic economy, it's just artificially taking away options from the people who live in your country. Okay, so that's, you as a general rule or principle, you don't make your people richer by taking away their freedom and their options. So yeah, you can't control what other governments are doing with their people. And yes, it is true if some foreign country enacts very high barriers to your people trying to sell them goods and services, well then that will, yes, make your people worse off. But nonetheless, you still do the most you can by having free trade policies at home. All right, so, but just to give you a silly analogy, if a foreign government starts lobbing up hand grenades that hit its own people and then also throws some across the board that hits your people, right? So that foreign government is doing things that both hurt its own people and some of your people. You don't respond or reciprocate and level the playing field by saying, oh, well, if they're doing that, well, then we're going to start throwing up random hand grenades and blowing up our people and some of their people too. No, that just means you're also being destructive and causing net harms. So it's the same logic when it comes to trade barriers. Yes, foreign government imposing trade barriers hurts your producers, but it also hurts its own consumers. And then your government, when it reciprocates, if it reciprocates, it's not canceling it out. It just means it also is imposing net harms. Because that's the logic here. I should probably say explicitly, trade barriers do help certain domestic producers, but they also hurt domestic consumers. And in a certain objectively definable sense, the harms it imposes on the consumers is greater than the benefits to the producers. So that's the sense in which, on net, government-imposed trade barriers make the country poorer. All right, like I say, there is a well-defined sense in which we can talk like that.